From slamming the UFC for banning IVs to coming up with the simplest testing method ever, it seems like Joe Rogan has a bone to pick with the promotion after revealing the real reason behind the IV ban. Here's what he had to say. For starters, IVs actually mask PEDs. I'm not sure if you remember, but back in 2015, when the UFC first banned IVs, Joe Rogan completely lost it. He thought it was the dumbest move ever, mainly because it put fighters at risk. I mean, just think about it. Fighters undergo some of the most devastating weight cuts of their careers, and out of nowhere, the UFC decides they can't take an IV to rehydrate before their fight anymore. Along with calling it a dangerous and stupid move, Rogan said taking IV should be permitted because, well, cutting weight is permitted. Get it? How in the world is a fighter supposed to go out, compete, and put on a show after dropping 8 kilograms in just 5 hours? It just doesn't make any sense. But here's the thing. This was Joe back in 2015. On a recent episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, the podcast host had former UFC fighter Jorge Masvidal on the show, and while talking, the topic of IVs came up. It was interesting because Rogan had completely changed his view on the ban. He shared how the real reason why the UFC actually banned IVs wasn't because they thought it was unfair or against the rules. It became illegal because it helped fighters mask PEDs. Yup, I'm not making this up. Fighters loading up on PEDs for unfair advantages had their work cut out for them. All they had to do was take an IV right before testing, and that's it. The PEDs wouldn't show up in the results. American gangster Chael Sonnen thinks USADA shot themselves in the foot after the IV ban. On a recent episode of the MMA Hour, retired fighter Chael Sonnen and MMA journalist Ariel Helwani had a blown-out discussion about IV usage. Believe it or not, Sonnen even claimed he had real knowledge about Islam Makhachev's potential IV usage before UFC 284. And while he did say he'd never reveal anything, the American gangster really had a go at the nurse who administered it. I'll get to that in a bit, but first, let's talk about what Chael had to say about USADA. Before the anti-doping agency partnered with the promotion, fighters were getting bigger day by day. They were packing on insane amounts of muscle. And what's interesting is, the fighters at the top stayed at the top. It was only after USADA started testing did we see the biggest and deadliest fighters slowly start to fall from the pedestal. There were literally champions who never saw another title fight in their entire careers after USADA started testing. So, while it was good for cleaning out the sport, Sonnen thinks they made a colossal mistake when they banned IVs. Along with drastically losing all their muscles, fighters were testing positive left and right. But when USADA announced they were banning IVs because it masked PEDs, a light bulb switched on in almost everyone's head. As a fighter, you could literally beat USADA by taking an IV. In case you don't agree with Sonnen, notice how fighters are starting to get big again. But let's step back for a second. What's the official USADA policy regarding IVs? Well, it's not really about what fighters inject in their body. It's more about how much they can inject, because taking an IV isn't exactly banned. Taking more than a certain amount is what gets a fighter in trouble. USADA doesn't allow any active fighter to take more than 100 milliliters of any substance within a 12-hour period. And considering how little 100 milliliters is, taking that isn't exactly going to give anyone a significant advantage. But when you think about it, that's the whole reason why they're trying to control intake and volume. And since there's no point in taking such little of a substance, they avoid doing it altogether. So that's basically what the anti-doping agency has to say about IVs. But whether you can mask PEDs with just 100 milliliters is the real question here. No one really knows, and honestly speaking, how is USADA or the UFC going to figure out how much of a substance was administered? Don't you remember what went down at UFC 284? Islam got blasted by Dan Hooker for taking an IV before his champion versus champion fight against Volkanovski. Hooker claims Makhachev tried being so slick, he went to a private establishment and got a nurse to inject him with an IV. As of right now, Islam, USADA, and the UFC are all quiet. No one has said anything about the allegations. But remember what I said earlier about Sonnen knowing the truth? Well, he's pleading the fifth now. Or in other words, he doesn't want to share the nitty-gritty of what he knows. But he did say a lot of other things, like how the nurse who took a fee gave Islam the IV and then told Hooker and the boys, making a major mistake. Sonnen says she shouldn't have opened her mouth, because if it was the 15 minutes of fame she's after, it did her no good at all. But instead of blasting the nurse, shouldn't Chael just come forward and tell everyone what he knows? Because if Islam did indeed take an IV, it's unfair to Volkanovski, because he did everything according to the book. The featherweight champion cut weight and took nothing illegal. On the other hand, Makhachev got an unfair advantage because he rehydrated. Plus, I know what I said about the 100 milliliter limit, but is there any way to verify how much he took? Or why wasn't an official present at the time when he was getting the injection? It's just really shady. And I often see MMA fans compare Islam's case to McGregor's, but it's actually quite different. Unlike Makhachev, Conor wasn't even in the testing pool. So if he did take PEDs, there's nothing USADA can do about it. But it does point to a lack of transparency in the policies. Because in light of what Rogan said, an IV can flush PEDs. So it's not just about whether Islam took an IV. It's also about whether he was on some other substances that might have given him an advantage. But MMA isn't the only sport that doesn't allow IV. Even boxers are allowed to take it. Remember when Floyd Mayweather got ripped apart for taking it before his fight against Manny Pacquiao? And the reason is exactly the same. The World Anti-Doping Agency regulations clearly state that taking an IV might mask PEDs before testing. Also, what's funny about this whole incident is that it was actually Manny who got blasted for taking banned substances. And later, everyone found out it was Mayweather who was doping up prior to their bout. Plus, this wasn't as simple as Islam's case either. I say simple because USADA or the UFC did nothing about it. But in Floyd's case, he claimed he had an exemption from the USADA, but the waiver for it was sent in 18 days after the fight. And you're probably wondering, how do you even prevent all this from happening? How can just a 100 milliliter IV cause so many problems? Well, believe it or not, the solution is actually quite simple, but you'll have to wait for it. Now back to the Mayweather doping saga. The case kept on getting interesting. Just before the fight, Manny's camp proposed a $5 million fine for whoever tested positive. Guess what Floyd's camp did? They declined. Even USADA came out to defend Mayweather. But why in the world did his camp decline? Were they afraid of something popping up on the test? Who knows? But on to the important bit. The solution Joe's been talking about. Rogan is hands down the smartest guy in the world of MMA. And I admit, sometimes he ends up saying some of the most bizarre things ever. But then there's moments when he comes up with things no one could have ever imagined. So, what does he think about the whole IV issue? Well, instead of worrying about controlling the volume or intake, why not just control the timing? What does he mean by that? So, you know how IVs can mask PEDs? Why not just test a fighter before they even take an IV? That way, anything banned will show up on the test before there's any confusion at all. Let's practically look at the solution for a second. Imagine USADA decides to start testing fighters 12 hours before their fight. No matter what, fighters must undergo testing at least 12 hours before. And if they're clear, they can take an IV, no questions asked, as long as it's within the prescribed volume. There's no possible way to mask their PED usage anymore. I told you it was super simple. Now, there's probably complications in this too. Like, is it ethical to test a fighter under so much pressure just hours before their fight? If it's leading to less complications and actually helps fighters hydrate and put themselves at less risk, then yes, I think Joe is a genius for coming up with this solution because it doesn't make sense any other way. I mean, just think about it. It's so easy to get away with PEDs since they're never going to show up after 100 milliliters of saline or something. So, from a simple and practical solution to a slick way of masking performance enhancers, these were Joe Rogan's thoughts about the UFC IV ban.